Hey, hey, hey! My name's Helianthus Cryptid, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is the third chapter of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. This fanfiction has emotional depth to it that I didn't expect, but I am not disappointed. So let's get right into the trigger warnings before I begin the chapter. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers. If you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to another one of my videos, such as the Adro series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 3. Liftoff. Samura Daichi knew that he was helpless. Kyoko and Tanaka knew that he was helpless. Everyone and their mother knew that he was helpless. He had lived with that fact since he was 15, fresh-faced from Izu Mitate Junior High, and introducing himself to Sugawara Koshi for the first time. Daichi didn't think that he'd fallen in love with Suga then, but the moment they'd met, he knew that the two of them would always be pulled together in some way. And they had been. A captain and his vice, a wing spiker and his setter. But then they drifted apart. It hadn't been intentional on Daichi's part, and he was sure it wasn't on Suga's either, but it happened anyway. It was just one of those things that happened after high school. They texted and called frequently at first, but as time went on and they got busier, Daichi saw his friend less and less. And even though they both stayed in Miyagi, it was still rare that they even ran into each other. And because Daichi was so goddamn helpless, he remembered every time he saw Suga since they graduated high school over 5 years ago. The first time they saw each other after their third year was a mini reunion that consisted of him, Suga, Asahi, and Kyoko, which took place about 2 months after they graduated, and the last being 3 months ago, when Daichi saw Suga crossing the street as he was driving to work. So when he woke up on a random weekday to a voicemail left in the middle of the night, Daichi had been surprised. Had Suga not said his name at the beginning of the voicemail, he would have thought it was meant for someone else. Suga's voice had been quiet but urgent, and Daichi wondered what was going on. He couldn't think of any reason why his vice captain was leaving him midnight voicemails that were softly spoken into the phone like some sort of secret. He's probably dying. The back of Daichi's brain whispered as he replayed the message for the 5th time. Oh fuck, he's totally dying. Daichi pressed his hand tightly over his mouth and reached for his mug of coffee. It made sense. The late night call that sounded totally like it was spur of the moment, I need to tell you something voicemail. The random, we should catch up bullshit excuse. Because really, why would Suga suddenly want to catch up after a year of no contact? He'd listened to the voicemail over and over again as he got ready for work and wondered when he should reply, or whether or not he should call or text. It was unnecessarily difficult because Suga was probably hacking up his organs, about to pass away, and Daichi had wasted hours thinking about replying, but not doing it. What do I do? He asked Kyoko that evening over dinner. Just call him back, it's really not that hard. Tanaka yelled from the bathroom because they were engaged now, which meant that wherever Kyoko went, Tanaka was close behind, which Daichi didn't really think was that much different from high school, but now Kyoko actually allowed it. And Daichi wasn't against Tanaka coming to his and Kyoko's weekly dinners. He definitely filled up some of the silence, but half the calls Daichi got from work were noise complaints caused by Tanaka. So it didn't really boost his reputation in the neighborhood. It kind of is that hard, he replied. I haven't spoke to Suga in a year. And he suddenly calls me. What am I supposed to think? Tanaka wiped his wet hands on his hoodie and sat back down at the table with a shrug. You said it yourself, dude. He's dying. At least have the courtesy to call the man back. Daichi put his head in his hands and groaned. I think Ryu's right, Daichi, Kyoko's soft voice cut in. He wouldn't have called you if he didn't want to talk. Meet up with him for coffee. I think it'd be good for you. Should I call him? Daichi asked and pulled out his phone. He flicked through it for a second and his thumb hovered over the call button. Will I wing it or will I write a script first? Tanaka reached over the table and pressed down hard on the green button. No time for thinking, bro, he said. He's gonna pick up at any second. Tanaka, you little shit. Hello? Daichi sat back in his seat and swallowed his words. He raised his phone to his ear and cleared his throat. Hey, Suga, he said, and looked over at Tanaka and Kyoko. The former's shoulders were shaking with silent laughter, and the latter was politely covering her mouth with her hand to hide her smile. Daichi! Suga's voice was light, and Daichi swore he could hear his grin. I was beginning to think you wouldn't call me back. Oh no, I was just a little busy, Daichi replied and swiped violently at the air with his hand and hoped that his friends would get the hint to leave. No, it's fine. I just wanted to know if you were free to get coffee any time this week. Daichi watched Kyoko pull Tanaka by the sleeve out of his kitchen door, and got up to close it behind them. This week? He asked, and Suga hummed in confirmation. Sure. I think I'm free on Friday afternoon, if that works for you. That's perfect. I'll text you the address and I'll see you then. Alright, I just wanted to know what... Daichi listened as the other line beeped at him, and then eventually fell silent. Tanaka peeked his head through the door. So, why do you want to meet up? Daichi stared down at his locked phone. I have no idea. He hung up on me before I could ask. Tanaka grimaced briefly before his attention was captured by the food he had left on the table. Something about driving made Daichi feel in control. It was the way he decided whether or not to start the engine, or to make a right instead of a left. He chose what to do when he sat behind the wheel, and something about that kept his nerves in check. And it wasn't like he was anxious about seeing Suga in person for the first time in over a year, but maybe his heart was beating a little quicker than usual, and maybe he kept running his tongue over his teeth just in case there was a bit of nori stuck between them, despite the fact he'd checked in the mirror twice already. So he took the long way, just to keep his sweating palms under control. The long way was the scenic route that was populated more by trees than it was buildings. It was a suburban area with a few construction sites here and there, but nothing so flashy that it drew tourists in or anything. If anything, the area seemed more like a long-forgotten memory than a country road, which was why Daichi always took the long way when he needed to clear his mind. Watching the half-built facilities in the area whiz past as he drove always took his mind off of things. He liked to imagine that the bricks and the scaffolding that littered his periphery could have been something that helped further their community. At one point, there had been rumours that the biggest half-built didn't even have a roof, really only the foundations of a building, was supposed to be a sports facility that rivaled the one in Sendai. Of course, nothing came of it, but Daichi liked to think that it would have encouraged a lot of local kids to participate in sports. Not that they needed it. Miyagi had reared its fair share of young professional volleyball players, which seemed to have helped the sport become a trend in the prefecture. It only took 10 minutes longer than going through the more urban areas because of the lack of traffic, so really, The long way was much more convenient. But unfortunately for Daichi, today it just didn't do it for him. His stomach still flipped when he stepped out of the car onto the sidewalk, and his chest still tightened in the anticipation when he spotted Suga's grey head of hair through the cafe window. And again, he wasn't nervous or anything, but Suga was definitely on his deathbed and planned to catch up with old friends before he kicked the bucket, so it was reasonable for Daichi's heart to be racing like it was, so he was worried. The bell above the door rang when Daichi pushed it open, but it went unheard. The cafe was full of people sipping coffee, laughing with friends, or quietly studying at secluded tables. Daichi swallowed thickly when he saw Suga from the corner of his eye, reading over a sheet of paper. Instead of walking over straight away, Daichi slowly made his way to the wooden counter. "Black coffee, please," he said to the woman behind the counter and handed her the exact change. After he moved to the pickup counter, he looked at the wall on the other side of the cafe, and definitely not at Suga. Well, maybe a little at Suga, because how could he not? Suga had always been beautiful, and especially was when he was sitting like that. Maybe it was the way the summer sun shined through the window and turned strands of his grey hair gold, or the beauty mark under his left eye that always used to capture Daichi's attention during practice, or maybe it was just the way that he was older now and he'd grown into his looks. Daichi watched Suga's head lift from his paper and his eyes locked with hazel brown ones. It took a second, but Suga smiled brightly at Daichi and waved. "Your coffee, sir." The woman from behind the counter handed him a white mug with a smile. Daichi quickly said his thanks and walked over to Suga's table. "Hey, Daichi." Suga pushed out of his chair and stood with a grin. "God, it's been so long." Daichi barely had time to put down his mug before Suga was pulling him into a tight hug that rocked them back and forth. "I know," he replied, and tried to avoid getting Suga's hair in his mouth. "I was surprised when you called." Daichi laughed quietly when they pulled away from one another and hoped that it didn't come across as awkward. Suga either didn't pick up on it or didn't really care because he sat back down in his chair with a light sigh. "Yeah, I was surprised when I called too, but we haven't spoken in so long and I wanted to hang out, you know?" Daichi took his own seat and tried to fight the urge to scoot closer to Suga, because this was most definitely the part where Suga tells him that he only has a month to live. "Totally." Daichi cleared his throat and twirled the spoon around in his coffee. "It was a little out of the blue, but better late than never." Suga laughed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, sorry for sending you a voicemail in the middle of the night. That's a little embarrassing." "Oh my god, no!" Daichi said. "No, it's fine. Teaching young kids must be difficult. I'm sure your sleep schedule is a little all over the place." Because maybe if he rationalized why Suga was calling him so randomly, it would actually lead to them reconnecting, and not some sort of deadly medical condition or something. Suga sipped his Americano. "Actually, I usually have a pretty okay schedule," he said into his mug, and Daichi felt his heart sink a little, because if Suga wasn't regularly leaving mysterious voicemails, then it probably wasn't a random thing. "But I wanted to talk to you about something, and at the time I thought it couldn't wait." "Suga, Koshi, listen." Daichi reached across the table and grabbed his friend's hand, which had just dropped softly from the handle of the mug to the table. "I don't care how long you have. I'm prepared to drop everything to do anything you want. Do you have a bucket list? I think that would be the best place to start." Suga's hand was warm under his, and Daichi almost shivered when Suga gently pried it away with his free one. He laughed loudly and covered his mouth with the tips of his fingers, as if that did anything to stifle the sound. It eventually faded into little giggles, and slowly came to a stop with a sigh, and Daichi was thoroughly confused. "Daichi," Suga said with one final breath of laughter, I'm not dying." Daichi felt like his blink was audible. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it quickly. "You're not?" he asked after a minute, and furrowed his eyebrows together. Suga shook his head. No, he confirmed. But I did want to ask you to do me a favor, like a big one. Daichi sat back in his chair and let his shoulders slump. Jesus fucking Christ! He had prepared himself for the worst, and the relief that washed over him hearing that Suga was very much not dying was almost overwhelming. Okay, he breathed out. Okay, what do you need? Suga's fingers tapped on the table. Honestly, if I could do it myself, I would, but you were the first person I thought of who could actually do something. Daichi felt his heart race against his chest and fought the urge to press his fingers over his pulse. There's a boy in my class, Suga continued. He's smart and charismatic, and I know with the right push he could be brilliant, but he's struggling at home, and I think it might be suppressing his full potential. Daichi nodded in understanding. Do you need me to check out his parents? Make sure he isn't being abused or anything? Oh God, no. Suga shook his head and clasped his hands together tightly. It's a little more difficult than that. He's Oikawa Toru's nephew. Oh. Okay. That was a little more difficult. Of course Daichi knew about Oikawa, everybody did. He went up in a plane, and when the plane landed, he was gone. Daichi worked for the Miyagi police, so he'd heard all about it, and had unfortunately heard all of the conspiracy theories too. A murder that was covered up by the airline, aliens, he jumped out of a window. That one wasn't very creative, or physically possible, but it had come up a lot. It was safe to say that almost everyone threw in their 2 cents, and Daichi was almost certain everyone had been wrong. It's always difficult for children to deal with the loss of a family member, he said with a nod. That's really unfortunate. Suga hummed in agreement and took another sip of his coffee. I was hoping you could help out, he said after a minute. Daichi raised his eyebrows. Help out with what? He asked. He noticed that Suga kept his eyes trained down on his Americano. I want to try and find him. I know the case is cold, but he wasn't abducted by aliens. He has to be somewhere. The relief that Daichi felt earlier was gradually leaving him, because what kind of request was that? Suga, I'm in the community safety division, he said quietly. I don't deal with stuff like that. I'm not a detective. Suga looked up at him again with a glare. And I'm an elementary school teacher, Daichi. What's your point? Daichi sighed and wrapped his hands around his mug. I get you're trying to do something good for this kid, Suga, but what do you expect me to do? I barely patrol outside my neighborhood. They won't let me near a high-profile case like Oikawa's. Suga huffed. It's not just about Kaito. We knew Oikawa. Let's be honest here. Daichi, he was a huge part of our high school careers, even if he was only in our lives for a brief time. I just don't know what you want me to do. Daichi watched Suga put the paper that he had left on the table into his shoulder bag, and push out of his chair with his feet. Suga, you can't leave yet. Come on, it's not like I can barge into the chief's office and demand to see Oikawa's case file. Suga stood up, pulled the strap of his bag over his head and adjusted it by his hip. I want to try, Daichi. What I don't want is to throw away the future of one of my kids just because you never even bothered to help me out. Daichi wanted to stop Suga from walking out because who knows when they would speak to each other again, let alone when they would see each other in person, but he didn't, because following Suga out would just continue the argument. Instead, when he got home from work that evening, Daichi knew right away that he would do what Suga asked. Because even though Daichi had become helpless at 15, he felt it a lot more at the age of 23. Daichi knew what the answer would be as soon as he asked Chief Suzuki. Sawamura? Suzuki took off his wire-rimmed glasses and placed them on his desk. He pinched the bridge of his nose between his forefinger and thumb, and then he looked at Daichi. There is no new evidence for Oikawa's case. We can't just open it up again for no reason, unless you miraculously have a fingerprint or a drop of blood that we can actually build a case on. I'm afraid I can't open it back up. And besides, you aren't a detective. Daichi nodded his head. I know, Chief, but I knew this guy when I was in high school. He clasped his hands behind his back and squeezed them a little in frustration. I can work it on the side. If nothing comes of it, then we can close it again. But if there's even the smallest chance that I can do something to bring him back, I want to take it. Suzuki stared at him for a long few seconds. It's a waste of department funds and equipment. We can't afford to open up cases that have no leads, and that have no chance of being solved. Daichi knew this, and he never thought that this meeting would go any better than it was. But Daichi was helpless, and the boy he had crushed on since he was 15 wanted him to try, and so he would. I know that, Chief, he said, but I don't need any fancy equipment. Just give me the security tapes from the airport and I'll do everything on my own time with my own computer and with my own money. Suzuki pressed his hands against his eyes and sighed out in frustration. The office was silent for a full minute, and Daichi left to sweat in his uniform as he watched the chief contemplate his options. Sure, Suzuki finally decided. But I don't want to hear you asking for any help. My detectives have their own work to do, and there will be no funding at all. This is your own little project. Daichi had to suppress a jump of pure excitement and nodded enthusiastically. No problem at all, Chief. Suzuki nodded stiffly. Go see Kondo, he muttered and wrote something down on a sticky note. She is the woman on the desk next to the window by the door. She'll get you your file and your tapes. He took the sticky note off the pad and handed it to Daichi. Thank you. Daichi bowed his head and left the stifling office. The woman the chief had mentioned, Kondo, was a middle-aged detective that had worked under Suzuki for over 15 years. Despite her alleged screws loose, she was admired by every rookie detective and praised by her higher-ups. Daichi walked over to her desk and handed her the sticky note. Sorry for interrupting, he said. Chief Suzuki told me to come to you with this. Kondo's black eyes scanned over the writing on the sticky note, and she let out a humorless laugh. You poor kid, she muttered and stood up from her desk. Daichi frowned and followed Kondo, who had started to move towards the door. What do you mean? He asked. Kondo led him down a hall and smiled bitterly. This case is a lost cause. We all have tried and failed to find Oikawa Toru 5 years ago. What makes you think you can do what we couldn't? Daichi followed her closely, barely a step behind. I don't think I can, if I'm being honest, but I want to try. Kondo laughed again and shook her head. Daichi watched graying black hair fall out of her bun. Listen, kid. She stopped abruptly and turned to face Daichi. This should have been a one-and-done case. Look at the tapes, find the boy, write the report, grab a late dinner. Unfortunately for you and I, this place is corrupt, and that didn't happen. Daichi reeled back and stared at Kondo's wrinkling face. Corrupt? What do you mean? The only reason why the chief gave you this case to work on in your spare time, Kondo held up the sticky note and flicked it with her forefinger, is because he doesn't think you can solve it. A community safety officer in his early 20s will not find Oikawa Toru, partially because you have no experience as a detective, but mostly because the whole thing was a cover-up. Daichi had heard the rumors that Kondo had lost a few marbles over the years. She had been a detective, but never had he believed it more than now. A cover-up? Why? Oikawa wasn't some shady Yakuza drug lord. He was a high school volleyball player. Kondo nodded.
And yet, no one has caught sight of him for years. Unless some extraterrestrial decided to beam him up or some shit, that boy was still on the plane when it landed. There's no way he vanished into thin air, so why has no one found him?
Daichi opened his mouth to speak, but Kondo had already started moving down the hall. She opened the door and stood back to let Daichi through first. It wasn't hard to figure out where they were. The shelves of boxes full of case files were a pretty easy tell. They are in storage. Kondo walked a little deeper into the room and took down one of the boxes. After brushing the dust off the top, she pulled out a case file and handed it to Daichi. "That's everything the police supposedly know," she said, and then handed a USB stick to him, and security tapes from the Tokyo airport that Oikawa departed from, and also from the Doha airport where he was supposed to arrive. The connecting flight left Doha and went to Madrid as planned, but Oikawa was nowhere in sight. So he went missing between the Doha and Madrid flights? Daichi asked and pocketed the USB. Kondo shook her head and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. He went missing on the Tokyo flight. He allegedly didn't get off in Doha. Daichi frowned. "I know that I've heard it so many times, but it doesn't make any sense." "Exactly," Kondo agreed. "Nothing about this makes any sense." As they walked out, Daichi wondered why Kondo didn't try to find out what was going on herself, and then wondered if it had anything to do with the fact that Suzuki specifically told him not to ask for help. "Hey Suga, I know you're probably not too happy with me right now, which is understandable. I just wanted you to know that I asked Chief Suzuki if I could try my luck at the case. Surprisingly, he said yes. Call me back when you get this, so you can help me find Oikawa. Alright? Bye." With a bowl of shoyu ramen on his lap, Daichi settled onto his couch to scour the security tapes. He had Sundays off, thankfully, so he decided to stay up as late as he could. He regretted it almost instantly! There was no better way to put it. The security footage was boring. It's not like he was surprised when he couldn't find Oikawa in the crowds of people in Doha Airport, but it was disappointing. It was like a moving Where's Wally, except Wally wasn't even in the goddamn picture. He'd followed Oikawa through the Tokyo airport about 8 times in less than an hour. He'd been accompanied by the middle blocker and the wing spiker from the Seijo team, and both of them had followed him all the way up to the gate and had waved him off. And that was the last of Oikawa the security cameras picked up. After an hour of combing through the footage for any sign of the mint green and white Aoba Josei jacket, Daichi took a different approach. Sure, it was already 5 in the morning, but Suga still wasn't picking up and Daichi had a job to do. So, bloodshot eyes tracked each face that boarded the plane, and hands with the shake of someone who had just inhaled 3 black coffees matched them up to the people who got off at Doha. After he tried to pry his eyes open for the 5th time, Daichi decided it was time to call it quits for the night. For the next few days, the security footage haunted his thoughts. When he was on break, he was looking at clothes and memorizing faces. He was reading the transcripts for the interviews Matsukawa Issei and Hanamaki Takahiro had done when Oikawa had first gone missing. Both of them had been quickly cleared off the person of interest list. It was never really stated why in the reports, but Daichi didn't question it. After all, he had watched them leave the airport on the tapes himself just the night before. And after a whole week of nitpicking and headaches caused by looking at his computer for too long, he finally found it. Clothes that didn't have a Tokyo airport counterpart. A profile he didn't recognize from before the departure. An unfamiliar woman in Doha, with shoulder-length black hair and an ugly orange sweatshirt that had not boarded the plane in Tokyo. She stood at the help desk and presumably moved her black bangs out from her eyes. She talked urgently, but from what Daichi could tell, quite politely, to the man behind the desk. She showed him her passport and handed him some cash. Daichi leaned in closer to the screen, but he could only see half her face. He watched and waited for anything that could possibly identify her. It wasn't long before her bag shifted her sweatshirt sleeve and a blue ink stamp was revealed. It looked like a club stamp, and Daichi snapped a picture with his phone. It wasn't much, but it was definitely a start. Suga, it's me again. Just wanted to let you know that I think I might have found a lead. Call me back soon. After asking around a little and showing the picture of the stamp to Tanaka, Daichi found out that the club the woman had gone to was actually in Miyagi. The blue stamp was the logo that belonged to a local club called Ground Control, which Daichi had never even heard of before. In fairness, he was never one for clubbing anyway. When he wasn't working, he was either staying in with Kyoko and Tanaka, or he was at the gym. It seemed nice enough, though, but considering he was there on a Sunday evening, Daichi assumed it was a lot quieter than on Fridays or Saturdays. Hello? He called when he walked up to the near-empty bar. I have a few questions. What Daichi didn't expect was Waizumi Hajime to walk in from the back room and stand across from him behind the counter with a bottle of vodka in his right hand and a name tag pinned to his uniform shirt. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. Once again, it took way too long for me to make this. I have many excuses, but I'll go with an apology and a slight explanation. I am very sorry for how long it took, and I just did auditions for my final performance of the year at college, which I am really excited for. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, or Rorian, on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!